Hey, howdy, hey, everybody. Hope everybody's doing well this Sunday. We'll do a short stream today. I know Shiz is going to go on. The the kid is here, so we're going to hang out. We've been hanging out. She just held me hostage at the bookstore for a minute. What's up, Sherry, R.A., Justin, Freddie first. Anacito, how you doing, buddy? Oh, ba-dum, ba-da-ba-ba-dum. Okay. So, where's the spelling error? Let me see. I just Hey, Carrie T, how are you? Good to see you over here. Only see you over at Biggins all the time. But that's good. That's all good. I know you're busy over there. But he provides oh. Okay, I'll inform my graphics guy. He may be asleep now. It's about 10. So here, let me where's that old one? Oh, I deleted the old one too. Dang. All right. Well, we're getting rid of that anyway. How's everybody doing? So my ugly mug for you. Well, I mean, it's good we check each other, right? We don't um we have thick enough skin to where that doesn't make people mad when we laugh at a spelling error. It's been raining. Uh, the temps dropping. So anyway, we've got 12 awesome people here. Oh, hang on, Nomad. I'll show you. It's nothing big. The if you need to take a break, it's the steak. That's all. Let's see. All right, we're finishing up chapter 1. Dude, this is a long chapter. But it's a long book. It's we have 11 hours and 39 minutes left in this book, just to make you aware. You're good. You're good, Nomad. We I'm glad we can just lightly talk about it and it be what it is. So okay, we already read that. Okay, there it is. All right. Um We keep Nomad busy. Um, so I know I typo all the time. It's we don't I don't think any of us are throwing stones. We're just smiling and going on our merry way about it. The effect of the new emphasis on counterinsurgency was magnified for younger troops by a shift in military doctrine that pushed responsibility for tactical decision making down to the lowest possible levels. Hey, Cap, enabling small units to operate more or less autonomously, far more than in our previous counterinsurgency war in Vietnam. It was common in Iraq and Afghanistan for convoys or foot patrols to be planned and led by lieutenants or sergeants well short of their 25th birthdays. You're good, RA. As Rebecca Johnson, Dean of the Marine Corps War College, has pointed out, that meant these young leaders were required to calculate the second and third order effects of their mission. Um, Second and third order effects. So this is where Todd gets his, what is it? How does he say it? Tertiary instead of tertiary. Would the justifiable search of a villager's home for weapons breed ill will and perhaps turn civilians against them? What are the tactical and moral repercussions of continuing a firefight with insurgents, given the increasing probability of civilian casualties? Better to protect civilians and risk that the insurgents who got away will later kill one of your Marines. For the first time, Johnson wrote, junior leaders on deployment after deployment had to make sophisticated tactical judgments that carry complex moral ramifications. Moral decision making that is not supported by current military training and educational initiatives. The unpleasant reality of death, anger, and destruction, the killing, the sense that their leaders had betrayed them, all made it more difficult for some troops to justify leaving their families. But they went. Even at the peak of the fighting in 2007, the rate of desertion was remarkably low, less than 1%, compared with about 5% between 1969 and 71 during the Vietnam War. Hey, Surrender Monkey. My neighbor was the first UK squad he put on trial for murder when he was actually protecting a CO. Man, that's rough. Yeah. I had that hard to relate to that. That would be rough. These realities and stories, like Stephen Canty's, raise troubling questions for those of us outside the military, as well about wartime morality and about our rationale for killing in just wars, and about our own responsibility for war's moral injury. What is the accountability of those who engineered the wars, of the politicians who pushed for and funded the fighting year after year, of those of us who silently accepted the rationales for war, voted for those in power, and paid our taxes? Just as those returning from combat often suppress the emotional pain of their experiences, so do we all draw the cover of collective amnesia over our part in war. Perhaps we are morally injured as well, and like so many combat veterans, are reluctant to peer into that darkness. The support our troops stickers that blossomed as the battle casualties mounted hinted at a deeper disquiet. Too easily, we have forgiven ourselves for neither taking part in the wars nor demanding an end to them. We have turned our eyes from the realities of wars to those veterans who return troubled. We assign terms PTSD and criticize the VA for not moving quickly enough to help. But we have not acknowledged what we know to be true about war. We have not acknowledged our regrets, nor burned them in the makeshift battlefield baptismal font. That last part of this chapter is pretty heavy thought. Um, I would I don't know obviously what the general public uh, thinks um, from the psychological background that I came from, um, and being in therapy. The general public, I do think sometimes um, suffers from that moral injury. The hey Heidi, um, that we to forget that survivor's guilt, right? Like the author is talking about his about when we we saw our buddies hurt or injured, um, and we walked away unscathed. Or we think about these things and kind of try to push that down, right? Sorry, my brain's short circuiting for a minute. Chapter 2. Regardless of the cost, the horrors make the fascination. Henry James, the moral equivalent of war. Let's go back there. The horrors make the fascination. Hey, freedom fighter, how you doing, buddy? Exactly. Why them? Why wasn't it me? It's always, I mean, you standing right beside someone and they're not with us anymore, right? Um, and you're like the amazing fascination of it. Even even when you're fighting and your enemy that you're facing down, you're like, how is it him and not me? And you think about, well, this guy may have had a wife, a kid, family that cares about him. But I had that at home too that I needed to get back to. Um, so why them? Why wasn't it me? Is so broad over so many things, right? When I would So I would deploy for shorter amounts of time, uh, while in the army and during my deployment, then after retirement, then and then my time doing a special capability stuff. Um, I spent more time like Josh in out of uniform than in uniform doing intel stuff. So the why them, why wasn't it me uh is strong. Hey Top, how are you? Uh I happy anniversary by the way. Congratulations on 42 years. Uh that is quite an accomplishment. Sorry you had to spend it listening to some bullshit. Yeah, I mean, we do those things. In the first chapter yesterday, we were talking about talking about during firefights. The Marines were doing CPR on victims that were just gone. Right. This was children uh, that the Taliban had shot. Um, so we do an irrational thing to to that would be rational in any other circumstance other than things like this, right? Yeah, the video was good, Mrs. Metcalf. If y'all haven't watched Top's new video, go over there, give it a watch. Like, so let's get back to this. The horrors make the fascination. So the general, I haven't read this, but the horrors generally, is where the hero worship comes in, and the and everybody's so fascinated with veteran worship, et cetera, et cetera. So let's see what he has to say about this. So this is Henry James from The Moral Equivalent of War. In the dusty Ethiopian village of Jijika, I once watched a man die from his combat wounds, and I did nothing to help him. It was my own very minor but personal introduction to moral injury and might have informed my reporting on war and warriors over the following decades. I should have been the seed of this book, but for too long I let it go unexamined, not even having a name for this most common but largely unrecognized injury of war. As a Time magazine foreign correspondent, that answers our question right there that we had yesterday. Was he on assignment or was he independent? As a Time magazine foreign correspondent, I was covering my first battle in a sporadically vicious war in 1977 fought between Somalis and Ethiopians. Hey, Wingspan, how are you? Somali warriors had swarmed in from the desert behind a couple of World War II Russian built tanks, and after a bloody battle, had seen the Ethiopian garrison fleeing. while the Somalis were celebrating. Three fighter bombers of the Ethiopian Air Force showed up. Two American-built F-5 jets and an ancient but effective British Canberra bomber each made three shrieking passes with bombs and rockets, and then raked the survivors with 20 millimeter cannon fire. I was unwounded but stunned, terrified, in the bone rattling thunder of the jets at treetop level. At the concussion of the bombs, the blizzards of steel shrapnel, and the pounding of cannon fire, and when the pilots finally relented, they left behind the crackle of burning wreckage and the cries of wounded rising with columns of dirty smoke into a brilliant blue sky. I'd crawled to a place of relative safety, a low stone wall beneath a stunted tree, where I huddled in terror, dreading the return of the planes. And unable to move, near me, a man sprawled semi conscious on an olive drab stretcher. He had been a patient at the local medical clinic and was badly damaged. Its pale green walls of sheet metal were peppered with shell holes, and two bodies lay crumpled in a pool of blood in the doorway. Let's see. Oops. Oop. Billy Cox. A lot of blame goes around, and it's not really fair, really. A lot of my guys are still finger pointing at our CO for loading a lab with 13 Marines. It was chaos. As it usually is, Billy. I mean, the bit I've seen is has been has been a subject of much reflection, I guess is the best way for me to put it. The man in front of me had been wounded again in the airstrikes, and now lay partially covered with a blanket, darkening with blood. His head swathed in bandages, and his chest a mangle of flesh. Blood dribbled across his chin. He mouthed the word, then again, Baji, water. I knew he wanted a drink. I also knew I was too scared to go find water. I was not going to risk my life to ease his suffering. I sat still, looking away, and a few minutes later he coughed and died, and flies landed on his face. For me, a flicker of guilt and shame has stayed with me, an event that suddenly altered my view of myself as a good person. RA. And hindsight is 2020, so easy for people to judge after the fact when they weren't the ones responsible for making the decisions. Like a certain caricature on our in our little sector, uh, saying that some of us committed atrocities and war crimes. Um, angers me to no end. I mean that's almost a line too far for me. Let's see. It should have given me an early insight into the far more troubling experiences of those we recruit and send into war. It should have awakened me to the cruel moral choices they must often make and to the moral injuries they bring home. But like most of us, I looked away. I grew up in a Quaker family in a comfortable, leafy suburb of New York. Far from any military base, my mother and father were the gentlest people I have ever known. They worshiped in a plain meeting house built in 1812, tucked away behind high walls. As a child, I fidgeted through our long, silent meetings on Sundays, dreaming of far off adventures and swinging my legs beneath the hard wooden bench until my mom put a quieting hand on my knee. Thank you, Carrie T. And Nomad, I saw you put up there earlier as well. Um, Gunplay and the imagined glory of war were an important part of my childhood, as for most kids in the neighborhood. We spent hours, long division homework, abandoned shooting our toy cat pistols at imaginary enemies, and perfecting the art of toppling over in romantic, immaculate death. I was 10 when my family began hosting a young Japanese woman who had been badly burned and disfigured in the atomic blast in Hiroshima in 1945. One of the Hiroshima maidens. They had been schoolgirls at the time, and a decade later, Quakers brought them to the United States for reconstructive surgery. It was she, not a heroic soldier in a splendid uniform, who was the first person I met with direct experience of war. I had to steel myself not to stare at her stick like arms from which flesh had been burned, and to meet the eyes in her heavily scarred face. Thank you, Freddie. And thank you, Nomad, for reiterating it so I knew he had said something. At Quaker gatherings, we studied Gandhi and nonviolent resistance, a way to force social change that seemed like an obviously good alternative to incinerating schoolgirls. As I reached high school age, I came to appreciate silent meeting as a respite of peace. The silence deepened on lazy summer mornings by the sleepy drone of bees, no bees, and swish of distant traffic. When I turned 18, I was required to register for the draft. I signed as a conscientious objector. With the clarity of youth, I told my draft board that I wanted to serve my country, but that killing was morally wrong, and I would not take part in it. I did 2 years of civilian service with an international Quaker relief agency and then became a journalist. In 1977, Time magazine assigned me to Africa. The editors wanted upfront coverage of the guerrilla wars, civil conflicts, and violent coups that were racking the continent in the late 1970s. Um, I was young in the late 70s, but reading about it was a tumultuous time in Africa in the late 70s. I think a lot of post-colonial and getting rid of colonial ideals was going on. The editor, let's say, and with no special training or preparation, I went out in the blasted wastelands of Somalia. the bloody terrors of Mozambique and Ethiopia, and among the scowling young killers of Uganda and Congo, I was often scared. I was stunned by the carnage and waste of war, the casual killing, the scale of human suffering, the dead of night dread, cowering as a detonating mortar, rounds and heavy machine gun fire crept closer, turning my guts to liquid. The drunken, murderous young soldiers at checkpoints, the empty dirt roads that held either landmines and death or a good story. Why, thank you, Billy Cox. Love you too. Always stay positive and take it one breath at a time. The air seemed always scented with burning tires and lush bougainvillea, bougainvillea, a rotting fruit and rotting flesh. At the same time, I was inspired by the courage of those caught up in war. The refugee families and volunteers at hospitals that lacked sanitation, antibiotics, and sometimes even beds. The slender young Ugandan nun who smuggled Catholic believers out of a mad dictator's grasp, less nobly, I was mesmerized by the adventure of the adrenaline rush. I was thrilled afterward at my own escapes from peril. I saw myself as the heroic, calloused foreign correspondent. I drank. I had nightmares, outbursts of anger I could not explain, and I wanted more. To be clear, having once acted on my own conviction that killing was morally abhorrent, and having been accorded the government certified status of conscientious objector, I found war itself to be irresistible. I left Africa after 4 years, returning to cover the Pentagon. I immersed myself in nuclear war fighting theory, defense budgeting, and weapons technology. With a small pool of reporters, I traveled the world with the Secretary of Defense and even had my own desk in the Pentagon press room. But I got bored with Washington, easy to do, and was eager to learn what the military actually did. I discovered that they welcomed my interest, and I sailed on the TAC and the strategic missile submarines and aircraft carriers, flew on bombers, and climbed down into a silo where the International Ballistic Missile, armed with multiple nuclear warheads, hummed on alert. The most compelling work of the American military, I found, happens away from Washington. In its obsessive training and grueling combat exercises, I spent as much time as I could with troops in the field, out in the piney woods of Fort Bragg, Fort Drum, Fort Polk, and the swampy scrumland of Camp Lejeune, where the clatter of helicopters, the shrieking of tank turbine engines, and rumble of treads and the firing range crackle of M4 carbines and thudding of 50 cal machine guns rise beyond the manicured lawns, neat split level housing, child care centers, and sports clubs of modern military life. At the vast training ranges at 29 Palms and Fort Irwin in the Mojave Desert, I watched the Marines and soldiers maneuvered by the thousands with tanks, artillery, airstrikes by jets and helicopter gunships, replicating the tempo and confusion, if not always the live ammunition of modern warfare. Every skirmish and battle would be followed by an after action review. Enlisted infantrymen and artillerymen, scouts, and tank gunners, privates, and sergeants and colonels gathered to review what went right and who did wrong, and I have seen comrade commanders accepting responsibility for unclear commands or tactical errors pointed out by 19-year-olds. As the troops trained, I learned when to duck and when and where to run, how to live out of a rucksack sack and stay relatively comfortable in rain, snow, heat. My Quaker mother was mildly offended, but intrigued that I knew how to fire a mortar and treat a sucking chest wound, that I had worked for a few hours in the bowels of a Marine Corps M1A2 main battle tank as a loader, wrestling live 54-pound high explosive shells out of the rack, ramming them into the breech of a 120 millimeter gun, and then squeezing out of the way as the huge gun thundered, recoiling with flame, smoke, and bits of burning ash. When there were wars, I went wearing my own helmet and body armor, a 32-pound Kevlar vest with hardened ceramic plates, front, side, and back, and living in the rain and desert heat with soldiers and Marines in their squads and platoons. Counterinsurgency missions with Marines in Somalia, then the Persian Gulf Tanker War, Saudi and Iraq for Desert Storm, Bosnia before and during the U.S. peacekeeping operations, then Afghanistan and Iraq again and again. I came to know guys like Nick Rudolph, Darren Doss, Stephen Canty, and others, men and women I like to think of as blue collar working class of the military. They are the mostly young, mostly enlisted soldiers, airmen, sailors, and Marines, who are the infantry grunts, the trigger pullers, the wrench turners, the watch standers, the tank drivers, the helicopter crewmen, the medics. Those in higher ranks referred to usually not fondly as higher. Make strategy, write doctrine, and devise tactics. The working class military is responsible for making it all work in the real world, even when all the higher has it wrong, when they think the higher has it wrong. Fort Drum is about 2 to 3 hours south of my camp, and about 4 hours from my home. Oh, wow. Uh, then you're in some cold weather. For all their youth, the 23-year-old female turret gunner, the 25-year-old jet fighter maintenance chief, the 21-year-old infantry squad leader carry immense responsibility. They handle it well and with passion. They get their hands dirty. In Afghanistan, I once met a young medic, Private First Class Randall Bone, a short, stocky guy with a boyish grin. On his first combat patrol on a soft spring evening, the lead truck in his convoy was hit by a rocket propelled grenade or an RPG. Did it break his legs? It smashed into the cab, sliced across the face of the driver, and detonated in a blinding flash where a lieutenant was sitting beside him. The explosion drove glass and shards into the driver's face and into the legs of the turret gunner. The lieutenant took the full force of the blast and the shrapnel on his face and head. Medic Bone ran up from a following vehicle and wrenched the door open and gently drew the lieutenant down from the wreckage. He was barely conscious, his skull covered in blood, his eyes swollen shut. As other soldiers took up security positions and began radioing for help, Bone tended to the lieutenant, gently wrapping his head in gauze and trying to keep him conscious through his pain. While patching up the gunner and the driver, the wounded officer needed brain surgery. Bone knew. In a story I wrote several weeks later, Bone explained, "It's extremely tough when all you can smell is blood and people are suffering, and there's not a lot you can do for them. You can't miraculously heal somebody with an RPG wound. When you get somebody hit with head trauma as bad as the LT, there's not a lot you can do for him in the field." But Bone kept him alive. It took all night for the wounded to be medevac and the damaged vehicle to be towed back to the U.S. base at Bagram. Bone helped clean the blood out of the truck, then went to check on the lieutenant at the hospital, at the base hospital. "Hey, Pat Scats, you're good. Glad you're here." Bone was, let's see, the officer had undergone emergency surgery and was doing well, Bone was told. He would be flown out shortly on an Air Force aeromedical plane. As soon as I made sure I hadn't lost anybody, I asked if there was a sink I could use, Bone recalled. The sleeves of my shirt were soaked with blood. There were patches of blood on my pants and face, and my hands were caked with blood. A nurse directed him to a sink. I probably spent a long time at that sink. The photo I took of Private First Class Bone shows him with a cocky smile and hard eyes at the time. He was 19 years old. Living with people like Bone and others in the blue collar military, I came to stand a little straighter, wear my hair a little shorter. From them, I absorbed the creed of immediate and direct personal responsibility. Taking care of your buddies always, no matter what, trusting they would do the same for you, doing the right thing when no one's looking. I came to admire their grit, their sense of honor and commitment, their unfailing humor, their courage, their spontaneous generosity. Hey, Donald, good to have you. You're always welcome, bud. You're always welcome. Thoughts are welcome as well. I have watched them wrestle with difficult decisions and have sometimes winced at the directions they chose. I have known some of their families. I've watched tense leave takings and joyful homecomings. In the chilly pre dawn hours beside a distant runway, I have stood motionless with hundreds of saluting soldiers as flag draped coffins were carried gently up the ramp of a waiting cargo plane with grieving families. I have attended burials at Arlington Cemetery. Hey, Michael, I hope you're doing well, buddy. At war, I have seen Americans at their best. In a very personal way, I admire and honor their service. Eventually, though, I could no longer ignore the nagging sense that something was wrong, that I was looking away from the dark side of war, which was causing real damage to the men and women I knew. Too many good people were returning home disquieted by their experiences. Some sought therapy, but most did not. Some were diagnosed with post traumatic stress disorder. Most were not. But so many were ill at ease with something deep inside themselves, not entirely comfortable with the way they had changed. We always could do better, Michael. Just remember you're standing tall and taking it one day at a time, brother. Just remember, this too shall pass. It's only now, as the flurry of combat deployment slows, that we can pause and take stock. Being at war, I've found, is rarely conducive to introspection. You're too anxious, too busy, or too stunned by heat and boredom, or the sudden surge of adrenaline to find quiet. Stephen Canty explained it well. None of us really knows what it's like until we go over there, and we go two, three, four times before we ever pause to think about what we're doing, he once told me. Several years after his last combat tour in Afghanistan, only now, he said, do we start to look at the mental effects of killing other human beings. We keep going regardless of knowing the cost. Excuse me. Knowing what it's going to do, Canty said. The question we have to ask the civilian population is it worth it? Knowing these mental issues we come home with, is it worth it? In early 2008, I went to war with Stephen Canty's battalion, the 1st Battalion of the 6th Marine Regiment, familiarly 1/6. Marines and soldiers, grunts, typically deploy as part of a brigade of 3 or 4,000 people, divided into battalions of 800 to 1,000. The numbers vary by service and mission. Guys like Canty identify from the bottom up. First is their fire team of 4. 3 fire teams make up a squad, usually 12 or 13 Marines. Squads make up a platoon of 40 to 45 Marines. 4 platoons make up a company of perhaps 200 or 250 Marines. Companies are identified by code words representing letters Alpha, Bravo, Charlie. So phonetically, since he's a non-combat guy or a non uh, military guy, he's a reporter, so he doesn't get it all right. Um, in combat, Marines often fight in fire teams of 4, perhaps led by a lance corporal who may not have reached legal drinking age. Canty served with the 2nd Platoon, Charlie Company, 1/6, along with others I would get to know. Nick Rudolph, Chuck Newton, Darren Doss, Xavier Zell, and others who died before I could get to know them. Lance Corporal Zachary Smitty Smith, Sergeant Daniel M. Angus, and Lance Corporal Joseph Chiano, 2 of the 1/6 Marines I did come to know would be killed in Afghanistan. Captain Brandon Barrett and Lieutenant Jason Mann. Gunnery Sergeant Rosendo De Leon, who befriended me in Afghanistan, would die tragically at home after his combat tours were finished. During 6 weeks of training with 1/6 before I left, I accompanied the Marines as they practiced detecting IEDs, assaulting and clearing houses, rehearsing nighttime patrolling, and hasty attacks, and slogged through swamps to ambush off-duty Marines pretending to be insurgents. We know somebody like that. We lined up for shots and malaria pills and shopped at the PX for last-minute gear. I recall squirming on a folding chair in an overheated room for a droning lecture on Afghan culture, but I'm pretty sure there was no class on PTSD. and definitely no mention of moral injury or how to prepare for any kind of psychological war trauma. I'm getting my words all messed up. But the 2,000 Marines of 1/6 and its attached units barreled into Afghanistan with impressive energy, enthusiasm, and confidence and gear. They took their M4 carbines and anti tank weapons, rockets, and various explosives, and armored gun trucks, Humvees mounted with 50 cal machine gun or a 40 millimeter grenade launcher. They took their attack and transport helos, sea bags of personal gear, and wooden ammo crates of linked brass 50 cal machine gun rounds and 5.56 ammo and grenades, boxes of MRE rations, computers, radios, spare parts, boots, mortar tubes, and base plates, generators, Xboxes, and video games. Hey, Linda, how are you? You're good. Prepare for weather. That's the most important thing. Let's see, smokes and dip, trauma medical kits, and coils of razor wire, all logged on packing lists that ran to hundreds of pages and then packed into rugged steel shipping containers called Connex boxes. The Connexes went by ship to Karachi and then overland through Pakistan by truck. And the Marines and I flew out of the New River Marine Base in North Carolina, stopped briefly at Manas Air Base in Kyrgyz- Kyrgyzstan, then loaded onto a C 17 cargo plane that flew us into Kandahar Airfield, the major U.S. air hub in southern Afghanistan. The Connexes were waiting. Marines emptied them and engineers stacked them 2 or 3 high in a stockade around their desert encampment adjacent to the runways. I took a backpack with my laptop and the satellite phone and a duffel bag with my body armor and helmet, V-negged my blood type embroidered on both. I also packed a stack of new notebooks and several dozen pens, a combat first aid kit and tourniquets and malaria pills, and a softcover copy of Homer's Odyssey, a treasure at the end of a long day when I'd wrap myself up in my olive drab poncho liner and indestructible thin quilted blanket, click on my headlamp and disappear into the aftermath of the Trojan War. I was an embedded reporter living as an observer inside the life of the battalion. I went where they did, carried what I needed on my back, slept where they did, and ate when and what they did. Marines couldn't get over the fact that I had volunteered to come, had fought to be with them. Having set up many embeds, I was familiar with the long process, convincing my editors to let me go, then running the gauntlet of required permissions from the Pentagon, and finally receiving officially stamped orders authorizing me to fly on military aircraft and excusing the Defense Department from all responsibility if I was killed. It all moved quickly for us after that, in a blur of jumbled packs and gear, mounting excitement and last second hugs with anxious wives and crying children, until we departed Camp Lejeune in buses to the New River airfield. In the weeks before our first combat mission in Afghanistan, when six learned to endure the 120-degree heat and incessant wind-blown dust, we sweated through classes in detecting IEDs, struggled through close order combat drills, jogged along the dusty airfield perimeter road with full packs, and idly speculated on the lifespan of the Afghan peasants hired to prod the soil of adjacent fields for landmines. At dusk, I'd thread my way through sweating Marines sitting cross legs, stripping and cleaning weapons, and between gun trucks swarming with Marines doing maintenance. I'd prop my laptop on an upended ammunition crate, empty. There, I'd peer at my notes with my headlamp, trying to compose a story while sergeants bawled at their grunts. Helicopters whined to life on an adjacent aircraft apron. Generators rumbled, and a short walk away, F-16 jets shrieked off Kandahar Airfield's main runway and thundered away over the distant mountains. Story written, story written, I'd unfold the foot square wings of my satellite phone antenna and rotate them toward the sky and mutter a brief prayer. If I got a good signal from the Inmarsat satellite on high over the Indian Ocean, I'd connect to the internet and email my story back home. It almost always worked. I think my sat phone would get like 9,600 baud uh, in the worst places I was at. Uh, Sometimes get like 4,800. So sending an email was a chore at times. If I had access to a global broadcast system rig, I would definitely take that. I wrote a daily blog from Afghanistan about Marines and their lives, about the food or chow and the weather, about the latrines, sparkling clean. The grunts' wagers on whether they'd be home for Christmas as Hire kept promising, about the anxieties of young Marines, and about the battalion's first two combat deaths, which left everyone shocked and sobered. One evening, I opened my laptop and stood for a while. I'd gotten an email from my wife that morning, a crisp, clear Sunday dawn in the Afghan desert. Call me, she wrote. I dialed the number on my satellite phone. Your mother died last night, she said. She died peacefully. Your sister Anne was with her. Is there somewhere you can go to be alone? I took a shaky breath and stared out through the coiled razor wire at the bright, flat desert and the hazy horizon of the barren mountains. Armored vehicles growled along a distant road. Two platoons of 1/6 Marines in battle gear trudged by, raising plumes of dust. On the runway behind me, a C-17 cargo plane touched down and reversed its jet engines with a deafening roar. We will have a memorial service, I heard Beth say. I know you probably can't make it. News of an event like this, a death in the family, is not uncommon here, I wrote, and when it comes, it penetrates painfully. 1,000 Marines are sent away to war, knowing that among their many loved ones, there will be triumph and tragedy. Babies will be birthed while they're gone, and grandparents lost. Romances will bloom and wither. A beaming child will excel beyond expectations on a math test. A championship game will be narrowly lost. Someone will be arrested, someone married. In this battalion alone, 1/6, 58 Marines would become fathers. Only faint and indirect echoes of this rich other life reach us from home. I realized through a scratchy phone connection and a terse email. Can you call home? Yet we clutch at these precious glimpses, preserving them like grainy snapshots folded lovingly into a wallet. It is uh hey, give me a minute, please. It is perhaps the most we ask of those we send. Those rich moments occur far away and are lost forever. A child has a fourth birthday only once. The losses, like repeated body blows, accumulate in deepening moral injury. Men and women at war absorb the hard living with black humor, steel themselves against the risk of combat, temper their fatigue, homesickness, and apprehension by loving their buddies and being loved in return. They endure back home. Back home, we often count the cost of war in dollars and billions or trillions. We calculate strategic gain or loss. We honor with sorrow the dead and the wounded. No, I'm good, Mr. Metcalf. I only have a few minutes left in this chapter. How do we measure the sacrifice of home? It was here as well that I caught other glimpses of moral injury. How it differs from PTSD and how people in combat deal with what the Marine Corps delicately calls combat and operational stress. One day in the spring of 2008, in the stifling tent that served as the mess hall for 1-6, Staff Sergeant Julian Lum remembered the story of Molly and the leg. Lum and Gunnery Sergeant DeLeon, and a couple of others and I were dawdling over a table strewn with lunchtime remains of chili mac, tomato salad, and pineapple cake. A military staple uh, meal. Um, the Marines straddling the metal benches with their M4 carbines slung over their shoulders. The story had unfolded in Iraq the previous year when 1-6 had fought Sunni insurgents in Ramadi. One day, a suicide bomber had come at the Marines at a checkpoint. And when they got him stopped, he blew himself up. No Marines had been hurt, but the bomber's body parts had landed all over the place. In the retelling, Lum and DeLeon started to laugh. Both were handsome, tall, and hefty with dark liquid eyes. DeLeon was 40 at the time, on his second combat tour in 2 years. On that deployment in Iraq, the Marines had befriended a dog they named Molly. DeLeon explained to me, pushing aside his tray and hitching up his carbine. Already, he and Lum and Gunny Carlos or Orwellia, who had served with them in Iraq on that deployment, were starting to sputter and guffaw as they described the scene. Molly, yeah, here comes Molly trotting back to where they'd taken cover, and she's got a piece of the guy's leg in her mouth. And the Marines are going, Molly, bad dog, put that thing down. Lum collapsed in helpless giggles, unable to continue telling the story. Orwellia and Molly's going like, what I do? She's looking so proud, like, like a cat bringing a mouse, and she keeps on coming, and we're going, no, Molly, go away, get that thing out of here. We were all in stitches. Bum swiped a tear. Oh man, he managed. That was hilarious, wasn't it? That's the dark humor. The other stuff is hard, but shit like that makes me crack up. I mean, me and Jeff would be rolling all over the floor thinking about something like that. The Marines of 1-6 recently told me a similar story from their second deployment in Afghanistan 2 years later in 2010. This one had to do with what they called the meat wagon. They'd sometimes go out on patrol and get into a firefight, chase off the Taliban, and then set up a primitive base, securing it with sandbags and razor wire. It's a it's definitely a strange coping mechanism, Mrs. Metcalf. It's better than doing what I was previously doing. Securing it with sandbags and razor wire. A day or two later, they'd be assigned to head out in a Humvee they designated as the meat wagon to pick up Taliban and civilian bodies. And after all that time in the sun or in the shade of a tree, the corpses had started to putrefy and stink. Chuck Newton was often assigned to go get the bodies. Chuck is a tall, rangy guy from Brooklyn with a slow, deliberate manner. His dark hair shaved down below stubble in Afghanistan now is grown out almost shoulder length. He takes time to gather his thoughts before he speaks, as if his words are precious and not to be wasted or misunderstood. He lets them out a sentence or two at a time and checks your eyes to make sure you've got it. Often his stories start out dead serious and end in a burst of laughter. This story he'd told many times, but Canty, Xavier Zell, and other Marine veterans from 1-6 sprawled across the beds in a Jersey hotel room on a Sunday afternoon, drinking beer, were eager to hear it again. The bodies, Chuck Newton said, were like all blown up. Some of them you'd touch and they'd deflate. If it was in the sun, it'd turn to jerky, or into the shade, it would just melt or turn into goo. And you'd pick it up and the leg would stay there on the ground. Zell interrupted. The manicotti, he prompted. Newton, oh yeah, the smell was like, those fake cheese crackers. I couldn't get rid of it. On the drive back, my foot was actually sticking to the gas pedal because I had to had like congealed blood on my boot, and my hands were sticking to the steering wheel. Anyway, we got back and I tried to clean up with like napkins. I was so hungry and I had vegetable manicotti, this awful MRE, this tube with red goop on it, and I was eating it, and my gunner on the truck goes, "You got a little on your sleeve," and I go, "Oh God, that smell!" It was congealed blood from one of the. It was not manicotti. Well, at first everything was like, "Ugh," Newton making vomiting sounds. And for about 5 seconds, I'm about to puke and cry at the same time. And then somebody starts laughing and the floodgates open and everybody's is just like hilarious. Zell. And later I'm telling this guy, and then my buddy ate manicotti. Every manicotti. Everything becomes a joke, man. Life's too fucking short. There it is. But that was still to come when peril and death and gore had become commonplace. When I went with them on their first deployment in 2008, they were new, unbloodied, excited, and anxious, jumpy. With days to go before their first stop, an attack on the dusty market town of Garmsir in Afghanistan's Helmand province. They lifted weights at dawn, shaved one another's heads, and relentlessly cleaned and oiled their carbines. They wound duct tape around their waist to keep their body armor from chafing. Sergeants came in to check gear and spread the word. We're going into a Taliban hotbed, so expect heavy resistance. Oh, and y'all carry 3 days water. Ugh. That turned out to add 40 or more pounds to everyone's rucksack, even after we discarded extra socks and underwear. Socks and underwear don't add that much. I would just soon keep that shit. And the cardboard packaging inside our plastic wrapped MREs. Wearing the pack and body armor and helmet, I found in combat drills that I could fling myself down and take cover all right. Getting back up to resume running was not so easy. And I managed it only with a strong yank from Gunny DeLeon. Even with all my gear, DeLeon could yank me upright. He was that strong. He was hefty with noticeably plump cheeks, immensely respected by younger Marines and by me. DeLeon had assumed my well-being as a personal mission, and everywhere I went, he was right behind me, ready to yank me out of trouble. As the Garmsir attack approached, nerves tightened. Outside the gates, a convoy hit an IED and 2 Marines were killed. First Sergeant Luke Mercardante and Corporal Kai Wilkes, and the war suddenly got real. Sergeant Major Charlie Stanford, a balding, muscular man of 42, told me that the death of a Marine in combat is like losing a child. We were whispering inside a shelter during one of the frequent rocket attacks on Kandahar airfield. Stanford, a martial arts expert, had been in the Marines for more than 2 decades. A tough man. He was not given to expressing emotions, but he did now. Each death, he said, drives you to your knees. The choppers came for us after midnight, blacked out twin-bladed CH-46s, clattering down out of an immense starlit sky, lowering their rear ramps onto a moonscape of powdery dust where we'd been waiting. We ducked under the blades and awkwardly clambered aboard. During the roaring 45-minute flight 40-minute flight, each of us mentally rehearsed. As the helo drops the ramp, the first fire team races out and goes left. The second goes right. Both lay down suppressive fire as third and fourth top fire teams, and the correspondent comes off and goes right and dig in. Self and buddy aid for casualties until the corpsmen and the Navy medics who accompany Marines get to you. Re Recheck straps and snaps, adjusted the night vision devices attached to our helmets, and squirmed in the damp fatigues. Suddenly, our chopper flared, nosed high, and skids. If you're on a 46, is on uh, tires, but okay. Bumped to the ground, and the ramp yawned open. At the last second, it occurred to me that if anyone was shooting at us, we'd never hear it over the roaring din of the helo. When our turn came, we sprinted out into a warm night of soft sand. I went right, cleared the spinning rotors, and dove for the sand. Gunny DeLeon flopped down protectively beside me. Later that afternoon, huddled behind a wall with the battalion command group, I opened my laptop, and as I began writing, an RPG whistled low overhead and exploded against a nearby tree. I scrunched down lower and kept going, wanting to get the story done before things got worse. Finished, I got a good sat phone connection and with relief hit send. Garmsir, Afghanistan, April 20th. Hey, 420. More than 1,000 Marines, backed by artillery and helicopter gunships, stormed into this Taliban stronghold before dawn yesterday. I didn't realize it at the time. Too busy, too excited, my own brush with moral injury in the Ethiopian desert long forgotten. But the moral injury of 1/6 was underway, as it was for many others who served before and after Iraq and Afghanistan. The blue collar military we sent to war was supposed to be strengthened against a psychological injury by a rigid set of rules and values hammered into them as new recruits. All of these rules would come under intense pressure in combat. Some would prove invaluable. You are responsible for your buddy no matter what. Most would not. And perversely, some would actually deepen the moral injury of those who went confidently into battle. Okay, y'all. That's about all I can handle for today. That was a strong middle section there that I was not expecting by any means. We'll do it again tomorrow. I've got another Orwell series I'm going to fire up. And we're just going to keep hammering away at this time. Just know that times like that for me are cathartic to this day. Leave me a comment or something if you're going through something. My obviously the numbers for care are always posted on here. But my email address is in my channel description. So it was hard for me, and it might have been hard for somebody else. But Yoga would be nice, Wyatt. All right, y'all. Be good. And I will see y'all around. I know Shiz has a stream tonight, so let's not forget about her. Let me post a link to that. Thank you, Freddie. Justin, everybody, be good.